Hey, it's Dan Lier, human behavior expert, humanbehaviorexpert.com, and today I'm going to give you a short script, if you will, on the precursors of psychology. How did psychology come to be? When did it start? Who were the players? And here's the game summary. In the mid-1600s, about 1650, a guy named René Descartes. He was from France. He was an academician, a philosopher, a mathematician, and a scientist. And he was the first person, if you will, to distinguish between mind and body, almost like the ghost within the machine. René Descartes was the guy who quoted, "I think, therefore I am," creating a separation between mind and body. About 50 years later, in 1700, John Locke, an English philosopher and physician, came out with what he called tabula rasa. That's T-A-B-U-L-A, tabula rasa, which essentially meant blank slate. That human beings were born with no innate mind, that everything was learned. We had learned behavior. Shortly after that, in 1740-ish, if you will, David Hume came onto the scene. He was a British associationist who had a theory that our behavior was a result of associations based on memories and experiences we had. In 1830, 90 years later, the next guy to make some impact was a guy named Ernst Weber, spelt Weber. Ernst Weber, he was one of the first empiricists. And an empiricist was someone who believed that knowledge comes only from sensory experiences. Now in 1870, things start getting interesting. Charles Darwin, who I'm sure you are familiar with from the theory of evolution, he was a naturalist, and he comes out with a theory of evolution. And prior to 1870, there was no psychology. There was no separate field. There was science and there was philosophy, and there was no psychology. But Charles Darwin opened the door with some of his studies. Now in 1879 is when psychology was born. It was born by a gentleman named Wilhelm Wundt. That's a Wilhelm spelt with a W and Wundt spelt with a W, but he's from Germany. So it's Wilhelm Wundt, which is a much sexier name, if you will. He is the father of psychology. And the reason why he's given that name, if you will, is because he came up with the first lab. He created a lab at University of Leipzig in Leipzig, Germany, where people could do studies on human behavior, but also write about them in a journal. So as you can imagine, this was the first time where human behavior is being studied and being written about. And so people from all over were coming to Germany to take part in this new study, this new science called psychology. Now, right about the same time, here in America, William James was bringing psychology to the forefront. He was a prolific writer. He started off wanting to be an artist, but thank goodness for us that he became a writer. He wrote about psychology. He read about psychology. He really wasn't a psychologist, and he was an interesting guy. He grew up in a very wealthy family. His grandfather came over from Scotland, made a lot of money in real estate. They had an intellectual family. His brother Henry was an incredible writer. And they used to sit around the table and talk about philosophy and Swedenborg and the like. Very educated guy. Now, like any pioneers, there's descendants that follow. And the person that followed Wilhelm Wundt, who made an impact in psychology, was Edward Titchener. He was a British psychologist who created structuralism. That he believed that everything in the human mind had structure. Now, the gentleman that followed William James was a guy who really catapulted behaviorism. We didn't know behaviorism yet, but Thorndike, he was an American psychologist who studied under William James, and he created what's called the law of effect. Now, this might sound familiar because the law of effect, which he publicized in 1903, said that organisms move toward pleasure and away from pain. Move towards pleasure and away from pain, the law of effect, which really set the stage for behaviorism. Now, in 1900, things start getting interesting and more familiar, if you will, because that's when Sigmund Freud, an Austrian neurologist, came onto the scene, and he was an interesting guy. Prodigious work, yet he was the first guy to talk about the unconscious mind. 1910, around that time, was Ivan Pavlov. And Pavlov's work and conditioned reflexes led to the rise of behaviorism. Shortly after that, around 1913, John B. Watson, who is the father of behaviorism, Watson says, hey, Thorndike and Pavlov are on the right track, but we can't study cats and dogs. We need to study human beings. And so Watson, he takes it to the next level. He goes to work at Johns Hopkins University. Why? Because they had a baby clinic there. So he was working with brand new infants, newborns, doing experiments, and more on Watson later. Shortly after Watson, the most prolific psychologist in the history of the world, in around the 1950, B.F. Skinner was on the scene. And B.F. Skinner had a mission. This wasn't about conditioning rats. This wasn't about making pigeons turn in circles. This was a guy that was looking to create a better world. He was looking to condition human beings to have the most full, happy lives as possible. He was on the cover of Time magazine in 1971. And in 1960, a guy named Ulrich Neisser, that's U-L-R-I-C, Ulrich Neisser, he created what's called cognitive psychology, that said we could study things beside behavior, how people process information. And essentially, cognitive psychology was a study in how people perceive, remember, think, speak, and solve problems. So that's your short script, your game summary on the history of psychology. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find out more about psychology and read about the players on behaviorism.com. My name is Dan Lier. Have a great day.